Hello, welcome back to the Language and Power podcast. I am Michael Farrelly, Director of the Discourse Academy, and of course, as usual, Tom is with me. Today, we're speaking with Professor Arran Stibbe from the University of Gloucestershire, and who is also the founding director of the International Ecolinguistics Association. Hi, Arran.
Hi, great to be here.
Yeah, welcome. We're very excited to talk to you today. So Arran is best known for your work in eco-linguistics. So, of course, that's what we're going to speak about today. Let's start off with describing and giving our audience an idea of what is meant by eco-linguistics. How would you define eco-linguistics, Arran?
Yeah, well, there's many ways to think about ecolinguistics, and often like a one-line definition doesn't really do it. But if you want to go to like the highest level, then it's the role of language in the life-sustaining relationships of humans with other species and the physical environment. And the key word here is life-sustaining. So ecolinguistics is not about life and the future continuance of life on the planet. And whatever linguistics can do to help life to continue to be sustainable, to help people have well-being and well-being that lasts into the future, then that is the role of ecolinguistics. Get linguists to think about not just humans and human society, but the more than human world that we all depend on.
What I like about your definition there, Arran, is very much that, and all these linguistics with a prefix or any of these disciplines which have a prefix, is that even though it's ecolinguistics, I think the way you summarized it there, you very much made the point, this isn't an ecological slant on linguistics. This is linguistics being put to the purposes for the use of eco. So it's actually the linguistics is actually almost in the subordinate role rather than just being inflected slightly in it. How we can use our linguistic knowledge and skills to contribute to this bigger idea. Is that fair to say that you sort of see it in that way round? The linguistics is contributing to the bigger idea.
Well, yeah, exactly. Because when you look at the world and how it is now, we have some very serious issues around climate change and biodiversity loss, about alienation from nature, about even like factory farms and the billions of animals who are confined for their whole lives. We have some really big, important issues. And then we have some smaller disciplinary issues in linguistics that, okay, if everything was okay in the world, let's explore these little disciplinary issues and this, use of gerund in this language, or a fascinating subjunctive that you find here. But actually, there's larger issues. And so I think that using what we can do for ecolinguistics to make a difference to the world is really the most important thing we can do. That's not to abandon the project of linguistics or to abandon the idea of exploring language and saying something interesting about language. But we can do that through the lens of these larger issues. We can choose examples that are crucial in forming identities and crucial in establishing our society and putting it on a path towards collapse or on a path towards a more ecological civilization. So choosing examples which are really crucial, important examples is much better than what you tend to get in linguistics, which is made up examples that get talked about endlessly. So my PhD was about metaphor, and there were so many papers about John is a pig. And what I did is I went and I analyzed the metaphors used by the pork industry about pigs, actually. And then there's like this rich data which is actually affecting the lives of billions of beings. And I think actually you can get much more useful linguistic knowledge from these important sources of data than you can from the more artificial kind of little examples that people tend to use.
I think you talk about the whole discourses they create. Sorry, Mike, but talk about rather than the discourse that is created through all these texts is much more than individual examples. It's a way of thinking about, ecology, about meat industry, about all sorts of things, and you have to approach texts quite holistically. I think is that one of the things you're saying as well.
Well, yeah, and so there's particular texts, and then there's whole discourses where multiple texts are showing a particular pattern. It's a constellation of features. So looking at language at that level, you're not looking at an individual feature or an individual text, but you're looking at a discourse and the ideologies that discourse is conveying.
Yeah. And that brings us to a question just before we go into some examples. The idea, so the purpose of ecolinguistics broadly is, as you've said, taking the abilities of a linguistic approach and putting it to the service of sustaining life. Now, just to put it the other way around, I wonder if you could say something for our audience here. What is it about language that could damage ecosystems, the environment, and so on? I'm just thinking if somebody could say something like, well, it's not the language that's doing it, it's the smoke that's coming out of the power generations, or it's the people slaughtering the animals. What would your answer to that sort of question be?
Yeah, and people do get quite surprised because you've got language on one hand and you've got ecology on the other, and they can't see the connection between them at all. The reason why we consume so much stuff is because of the economic system that we're in. It's because of the advertisements telling us to buy lots of stuff. It's because of the corporations, and the corporations will be rewarded if they sell lots of stuff. And all of this is in the socially constructed world, which is the world that constructs what a corporation is, what the purposes of the corporation are. And it's the socially constructed world of the economy and how the economy works. So this socially constructed world is constructed through language. So, for example, economic growth. So economic growth is portrayed as the main goal of society. When the economy is growing, the newspapers, oh, this is fantastic, this is wonderful. So a supermarket makes a bigger profit. Wonderful, fantastic. And this pattern of language, which represents a growing economy as fantastic and a shrinking economy as a tragedy or a disaster, that shapes how people live their lives. It shapes the preferences of politicians. Are they going to protect the environment, or are they going to sell more cars? So language influences how we think and how we act in the world, and how we act has a direct influence on ecosystems.
I think I was struck by very two examples fairly recently. One, of course, we know with the weather, and newspapers have got a mixed history on how skeptical they are. Despite the fact we know that global warming is a bad thing, you still see the newspapers celebrating whenever you get an extra warm spring or an extra warm summer. Quite bizarre. But also after the crash of the mortgage markets a few years ago, and everyone's realization that things have gone badly, that very, very soon afterwards, I remember seeing the newspapers celebrating once house prices were going high again. And it's impossible to get rid of, even in the face of overriding evidence to the contrary. The newspapers, etc., still promote these ideas that warm is good, cold is bad, which I know you mentioned in this paper, that the British climate, which is actually quite good that it's moderate, is whenever it's dreich or miserable, it's seen as bad, and whenever it's sunny, it's promoted as good. And the same when prices are up, when investment prices are up, house prices are up, this is just celebrated as something good. And it's a very hard discourse to eliminate from newspaper headlines.
Well, yeah, and the weather example is such a great example because this is so built into British culture. And if you have listeners from other parts of the world, particularly hotter parts of the world, they'll think, why on earth are British people like this? If two British people meet and they sit on a park bench and they're strangers and they don't know what to say, the first thing they'll say is, lovely weather, isn't it? Which always means hot, sunny, bright. Or they'll say, terrible weather, isn't it? Which always means, a little bit of drizzle or, some clouds. So we've got this story that sunny weather is good and all other weathers are bad. And you could see this as quite a harmless kind of story, except it stops people from enjoying the many days when it is a bit cloudy or there is a light rain. And it encourages them to go shopping in a covered mall instead, or stay at home and buy things on the internet, or fly off to find the sun. And then when it comes to climate change, it's like, yeah, bring it on. We're going to have hot, lovely, sunny, warm weather. And even in the middle of a heat wave, then the weather forecasts say, glorious weather, isn't it? And so it's just this pattern that is built into the discourse of the weather forecast, and it's built into the discourse of everyday conversation. And it is a damaging pattern.
There are specific examples of that. I've analysed a BBC News story from probably 20 years ago now, probably slightly more because it was a few years ago that I did this, but that is trying to introduce to the readership on the BBC website at the time the idea that climate change was a real thing and that scientists had identified it and it was beyond doubt. So that kind of story was necessary probably at that time. But very quickly, this article switches round to, instead of exploring the consequences and the possible answers to what had been identified as potentially devastating climate change, do precisely what you've just described, Arran, which is then start talking in terms of, well, what does that mean for us here in Britain? Does this mean that we're going to now be able to have a Mediterranean lifestyle and sit outside and have barbecues and cocktails every day? And really kind of undermined the more serious message at the beginning of the article. And I think, for me, almost trivialized it and sort of let the whole thing off the hook. And even then asked the scientist who'd been reported on this, very eminent scientist, that question, will we be drinking cocktails on our verandas? And, you know, to be asked that out of the blue when you're doing some serious work on climate science, to suddenly be asked about this social side of things, I imagine completely threw this scientist. And he sort of said, well, oh, yeah, possibly. I mean, but having not probably thought about it, you know, kind of almost ambushed by this really weird obsession with a certain type of weather. So the real consequences of that really undermining the message, I think.
Well, yeah, so a better answer to that might be we might be sipping cocktails on the veranda if we're not dead because of heat waves and floods and the inability to grow food.
Yeah, these examples really kind of bring life to what we're talking about when we're talking about ecolinguistics. I was really interested in an example that you give in a chapter that we've been reading. We'll put the link to it in the description and the kind of reference book for people to follow up. So you're talking about in the chapter the idea of how animals are erased from much of the discourse around ecology and climate change. I wonder if you could talk a bit more in detail about what you found when you were looking at that.
Yeah, so I've done quite a lot of research about this. I wrote a book called Animals Erased. And when you are looking at a discourse like a policy document, you can ask, where are the animals? And I mean that in a grammatical sense. They could be modifiers of noun phrases. So, for example, fish stocks, the fish there is the modifier of the noun stocks, which is a kind of a subordinate position. They could be the passivated participant in a sentence. And so this means that they're the ones having things done to them rather than being actively involved in their own lives. They could just be not there at all. And you get this a lot in environmental discourse, that they'll talk about biological resources or biotic resources. And they mean animals are kind of there, but they're not mentioned at all. So they're kind of like missing completely. So yeah, there's various linguistic ways that are used to hide animals, which stops us from noticing and caring about them. And we just start to see all the ecosystems that life depends on just as stocks of resources for us to exploit. And then we got sustainable development, which means stocks of resources to exploit sustainably. That's not actually shifting the story. Yeah, so if your original story is about industrialization, say, and then you say, well, let's have sustainable industrialization, you haven't shifted the story away from industrialization. You've just put a modifier on there to make it seem better than it actually is.
What would be, so in that, let me just pick up one example. In the example of fish stocks, is the argument then that using phrases continually like fish stocks rather than an alternative, and maybe there is an alternative that you would prefer, when you say it makes us notice them less, I guess there are people who will always be concerned about living beings, lots of campaign groups, but is what you're saying that people within the industry are encouraged not to think about things in a certain way? and to think about them in another way, think of them as resources rather than something else? Is this a consumer thing where the consumers are almost, or policymakers are asked to close their eyes to certain ways of seeing systems and fish in this example?
Yeah, so when you look at the ocean and all you see of value in the ocean is narrowly commercial stocks of particular kinds of animals or seaweed, then you're missing the rest of the ocean and you're not noticing or caring about the rest of the ocean at all. So, yeah, you can dump pollutants so long as they're not going to affect the fish stocks. So that's a problem. When you only see the entire natural world as having utilitarian value, you're only protecting the little bits which create profit. But the thing with ecosystems is that everything depends on everything else. And you have to look holistically and value the whole ecosystem and all of the beings who are living their lives in that ecosystem. And if you look at it holistically like that, as something which is of value in itself, then you're going to protect the whole ecosystem. It's a very narrow way of looking at the world, just in terms of resources for humans. And in the end, it's self-defeating, because if you do destroy the ocean, then eventually you're going to destroy your fish stocks.
No, just when you're talking about that, I think that a nice link between when you're talking about these discourses and the things they focus on in some of the feedback on the courses that you've been teaching over the years with many participants worldwide. I thought a lovely bit of feedback was from one student who talked about, because you cover a broad range of things, and one of which is identity and identity politics within this, bringing it onto the individual or groups. And I think one of the nice bits of feedback was that one of the participants in your courses had referred to the fact they began to question the consumerist identity that they had, which they probably didn't think they had. They probably never thought of themselves as being particularly consumerist, but in opening up these discourses that they were being exposed to every day, they became aware of how that affected their way of participating in the world, and the fact they became aware of themselves as being shaped as a consumerist, which I thought was really interesting. This idea of conscientization of how they are affected by surrounding discourses was really interesting.
Well, yeah, so one of the things that I've done is I've looked at the discourse of neoclassical economics. And neoclassical economics is something that should have been retired a long time ago, but it still appears in textbooks right across the world, in the basic introduction to economics textbooks that are used in university courses everywhere. And so within this discourse of neoclassical economics, they define a consumer. So they actually pretend that it's kind of empirical, and what they're doing is they're looking at the world and they're modeling it mathematically, but they're not. They are creating the identity of the consumer. And this consumer only finds well-being through spending money, is insatiable, so always wants more and can never be satisfied, and is fundamentally selfish, that all they want is to increase their own well-being. They don't have any interest in anything else. So it's a social construction which is in these textbooks. And the thing is that then you have advertisers who try to create that model of the consumer in reality by making you insatiable, by promising that if you buy this thing you don't need, you're going to become a better person. So this identity of the consumer, people can realize how they're being structured into this identity, and they can just let go and not buy so much, and therefore not have to do this job that they don't like, and have more time to spend with friends and family and in nature and learning and giving to the community, which the New Economics Foundation says will actually give you well-being. Not what the advertisements say, which is buying lots of stuff will give you well-being.
Yeah, I always think that those kinds of discourses play on insecurities that are also then created by the system. They allow people to give their worst tendencies to come out rather than being encouraged to choose a different and better way. So, yeah, really interesting.
Picking up, going back when you talked about having to ecolinguistics and people saying what's language got to do with ecology and that sort of stuff. I was thinking at another level. I mean, one of the things you emphasize very much in this paper we've been looking at, but I think all your work shows it, is that it's working with lots of different people, working with citizens, working with science. But you talk very much about transdisciplinarity as opposed to multidisciplinarity. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about the contribution at the academic level is in terms of transdisciplinary research and work. Particularly, I think what you're saying about people having trouble realizing what language has to contribute. I'm sure that you've suffered the same as many people working in the humanities, in linguistics in particular, that scientists, hard scientists, natural scientists, whatever you want to call them, when they're asked to do interdisciplinary work with people from the humanities, think we can do the show at the end or do the cartoons or do a little song about everything that the scientists have taught us. And they don't actually get what we do and how it can contribute or what it has to say about these social problems. So, I mean, you're very much an advocate for transdisciplinarity. Would you like to tell us a bit more about how you see that panning out and how we convince hard scientists of the worth of what we do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's one of the big problems with academia, and the reason why academia has not been particularly helpful in solving the ecological issues is the way that it's split into separate disciplines. So the ecological issues that we're facing, climate change, biodiversity loss, they are not sociological issues. They are not environmental issues. They're not political issues. They are not religious issues. They're all of these things all at once. And so separating it off into separate disciplines, this is massively problematic. So I see the starting point should be the issues that we're facing in the world. Now these are the negative issues that we're facing with inequality and injustice and ecological issues. They're the negative ones, but also the opportunities. I mean, the opportunities to build a better world and to find well-being in ways that respect all of life on the planet, and the positive examples from around the world of people doing exactly that. That should be our starting point. And then we should be saying, well, how can academia help deal with these issues in the world? And if we were going to start right from the beginning, we wouldn't say, okay, how are we going to do this? Well, let's have the science department over there. We're going to have the humanities over here. We're going to have the art over here. We're going to have computing over there. We wouldn't think like that. We'd have everyone coming together and working together with the focus on the issues. So for me, that's what transdisciplinary is. You forget the narrow concerns of your discipline and you apply whatever knowledge and skills you have to the wider picture.
It links, I guess, with the idea of the ecosophy. Is that how you pronounce the...
Yeah.
Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so ecosophy is very important because what linguists do is that we analyze texts, we say something good about them or we say something bad about them. So critical discourse analysts will analyze racist texts and they will say, this is racist. And obviously that when they say that, they mean that this is bad. This is something that we need to do something about. We need to resist the racism of these texts. So what we're doing is we have a value system in our minds about what makes a good text, what makes a good discourse. This is with reference to our value system. Now, when you're analyzing racist texts, you don't have to be particularly upfront about your value system. Racist texts are obviously bad. You don't need to say, this is racist, therefore I think that it is a negative discourse. It's just obviously that it is. But with ecological issues, it's more complicated because we're dealing with humans, we're dealing with animals, we're dealing with plants, we're dealing with intergenerational justice, we're dealing with social justice across different countries. And so it's very important in ecolinguistics to be upfront about what our value system is. So if we're revealing the stories that underpin our unsustainable and unjust civilization, then we need to be able to judge those stories against our value system. And this is where I use the word ecosophy to describe that value system. It's a way of judging the stories that we live by according to your values. And it's called an ecosophy because I think that a value system must include more than just humans. It must include the ecosystems that life depends on. There's no point creating a fantastic equal society where there's no racism, there's no sexism, there's no homophobia, everyone is living in harmony, if that society is unsustainable and is destroying the ecosystems that it depends on for survival and is going to collapse in a few years because it can't support the life in that society. So all value systems, I think, have to include consideration beyond the human. Can't just ignore it. So whatever your value system is about the more than human world, about nature, it has to be considered. It has to be there in your value system somewhere. Otherwise, it is a defective value system. So an ecosophy is an ecological philosophy. It's a value system about how you see the place of humans in relation to the more than human world. So my ecosophy, I just called it living with an exclamation mark. And the exclamation mark means that living is something to be respected and protected and promoted and cared for. And then I expand on that. It's living for all species, not just humans. So we want all species to live because in the end, life is what's valuable. You know, beings always try to protect their lives. But we also want this to be with high well-being. We don't just want billions of animals on factory farms suffering their whole lives. It has to be living with high well-being. And it has to be living into the future. So this means staying within environmental limits. And I believe that there needs to be some kind of social justice. So staying within environmental limits means massive reductions in consumption, but that should come from the rich. It certainly shouldn't come from the poor because they need to consume more just to meet their needs. So I have this ecosophy, this value system, and I use it when I'm analyzing texts to judge whether they are destructive or beneficial.
No, I like that. I have students working with the ecosophy and it's really very useful. And I like you compare it to the scientific project in a way in saying that once you have this ecosophy there as an object, it's personal, but it's still an object. You can then use that as the base on which to compare things objectively, as it were, even though it's a subjective view. You now have something you can compare texts with. And I like the fact that you also talk about other people's ecosophies. That is your ecosophy, and there might be variations on that people can use. And that's all fine. I find that one of the things I want to talk about is that with positive discourse analysis, you talk about the positive and celebrating positive texts and finding, you talked about studies around the world where we can find things working well and people doing good work. My question, whenever I've critiqued this word positive, and I've written about positive slightly differently from the way Jim Martin talks about it, and you reference him in your book, and also I think the way you talk about it is finding these positive examples as well. I absolutely agree with you on critical discourse analysis, tells us this text is sexist. You say, well, so what? That's obvious. What are we going to do about it? Tell us what to do. It's very easy to do the critical stuff. When you find an example of stuff that is good, the two issues I always raise about this are whose value system is that? It's, it's not a universal value system. So, I think you're up front when you say your ecosophy is personal, but you say a text is obviously racist and therefore it's a bad thing. Well, the people who produced it clearly didn't think it was a bad thing. So how do we get beyond our individual likes and dislikes when we say something's positive? How do we reach the people we want to change who might not have the same starting points as us? Is one question. Whose valuation system is it when we've got a linguist saying, I really like this text? I always find that a bit problematical, as I think you probably know. And then the second one is when we take these examples of positive change, and I've done the same with myself in Guyana, and you've done stuff, and Jim Martin has done stuff in education where you see stuff working well. How easy is it to transport that? What is there to tell us that if you take this example, this metaphor, this story that we live by, that promotes harmony with nature and promotes positive, beneficial change. What must we do with that to make it work in a new context? Can we just transport it? I mean, why would something that works maybe in an Andean community work in inner city Glasgow, to put a really extreme example, just to highlight it? And these are always the two problems I have with positive. To me, they're problems that are to be overcome. I'm not saying they kill the positive project, but how do we work with other people's values? And how do we move a positive example from one context to another?
Yeah, so when I said about racist texts obviously being bad, I meant for the readership of the kind of critical discourse analysis journals who share that kind of general way of thinking. But you're right that there are many different kinds of value systems out there. Just one thing. So, the way I do it is I talk about the individual ecosophy. So I have my ecosophy. Other ecolinguistic researchers will have their ecosophies, and I don't say that mine is right and yours is wrong. I think we need multiple different stories, and if you just have one value system and you insist that the whole of the discipline of ecolinguistics must be based on this one value system, you might drown out some of the multiple stories. Mm-hmm. My point really is that an ecosophy, by definition, includes consideration of the more than human world. And if linguists are using an ecosophy to analyze the text that they're looking at, then at least the more than human world is considered. Whereas before in mainstream linguistics, it was forgotten completely.
Yeah.
So I see that in some, that although we all have different ecosophies, and according to me, some are bad and some are good, in some, it's better if linguists are thinking about the natural world. That's really what the main thing that I do is I say, well, you're a linguist and you're looking at this sexism and racism, but all these people you're talking about depend on the ecosystems that surround them, and you've got to think about them. In terms of translation to other contexts, well, not necessarily directly. And I think one of the key things in ecolinguistics is you notice that this particular way of structuring and thinking about the world that you're so used to that you don't even notice it is just a story. It's just one particular way of thinking about the world, and that there are other possibilities out there. And for me, that's the most important thing, that we shake the confidence that there's just one way to look at the world. Now, some of those are going to be translatable, and you can bring them back, and you can use the metaphors and the individualization and the pronoun use and the this and that. You can use those to make a difference. Some of them maybe you can't. Maybe there's this lovely way of thinking about nature in this particular culture, but we can't adopt it here. But just opening up and realizing that there's multiple ways of representing the world out there, I think that is incredibly valuable and is a first step.
Are there any positive stories that you found that you think we could have as an example of the kind of thing you're talking about there? Good stories with different ways of talking about the things that we in our society just take for granted.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, any kind of story that gives out the impression that animals and plants matter for themselves, that I see as very valuable. Linguistically, that could be realized by having animals and plants as agents of material processes doing things in the world, so actively living their lives for their own purposes rather than just being objects and resources. Rachel Carson would talk about salmon knowing the rivers. And this isn't anthropomorphizing the salmon. The salmon do know the rivers. I mean, they can swim down the river and they can spend 4 years in the sea, and they can come back and they can find the exact same river and go to the exact same place that they were born. They know that river. And if you represent salmon as knowing a river, so as a sensor of a mental process, you're showing that this is a being with a mental life. And that is a much more positive representation of salmon than just as objects on a spreadsheet that you use for calculating the profit of your salmon company. So there's all these ways of representing the natural world in ways that give it intrinsic value. Or we could have economic stories about reciprocity and sharing and gift economy. Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's a scientist and she's a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. She uses these fantastic first-person stories of interactions with her neighbors, both her human neighbors and her non-human neighbors, and the way that these interactions assure the mutual thriving of everyone and the planet. So the way that she uses language creates this new economic story, and it's one based on sharing and gratitude and abundance rather than scarcity and hoarding and lack and selfishness.
No, I think that's really interesting. I think one of the things I get from what you're saying there is it's still, I think, for the linguist who's working, to me, a linguist is sort of like, I use the metaphor of a nomad, because our job, I think, is to go between these different cultures and work out what's possible, and not to impose one upon the other or our own view upon the others, but to keep working between them. But it's, I think, then incumbent upon the linguist who's in this area, the eco-linguist, to be aware of all the possible ways of talking about the world, the stories we live by and all these things, so that they, first of all, become, of course, more and more conscientized to the power of language, so that we can all learn more, but also to have these resources so that when we work in different contexts, we have a lot more resources, language as resource, commodifying it, but using language as resource so that we can think about what might work in different places and be constructive in context, so that not all these stories and metaphors might work in every community, but it's very important that linguists as go-betweens are aware of all this potential that they can then use in particular bits of research and applied work.
Yeah, well, one piece of research that I would quite like to see is research about the weather that could inform the weather forecast. So, and I'd like to do this, if I ever have time, I'd like to do this, but looking at how the weather is talked about in different countries. For example, a hot country where the rain is seen as something incredibly valuable, something extremely precious. What kind of linguistic resources do they use to describe that? And can we put them into our own weather forecast? So it's been, a heat wave for like a few days, and then we get some rain. And typically they say, well, there's a threat of rain, but, can we have a weather forecast which, represents rain in a very positive way, something that benefits life if it's the right amount at the right time? Or the mist and, how beautiful and magnificent and mysterious, the mist can be rather than it just being murky. So can we bring, the words of nature writers in English and the words of communities from around the world and have a much more enchanted weather forecast that really encourages people to enjoy all different kinds of weathers and see themselves as part of the weather world, rather than somebody who has to stay inside every time there's any kind of weather other than hot sun.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Arran, you've given us a really fascinating introduction to your own work and to the idea of ecolinguistics. I think it's been a great discussion, but what's either for you or for the idea of ecolinguistics, where can people find out more? Is there a wider project and a kind of direction that you can detect, or what would you say?
Yeah, so the thing with ecolinguistics is you are analyzing language and you're noticing these patterns which are influencing people's actions and could be benefiting or destroying the world. But then you notice that the same kind of patterns appear not just in language, but in visual images as well. And then you notice that, well, actually it's also in music and it's also in gardens. And, what you're talking about in the end is stories. So stories in the sense of these mental constructs which are influencing how we think, how we talk, and how we act. And so these stories are built into language, of course, but they're also built into anything which is designed. A garden, a Zen garden compared to a perfect English garden with like regimented rows of different colored flowers. These are telling stories about human relationships with the natural world. So you start with linguistics, but then you notice that, well, what you're really talking about are these cognitive structures in people's minds that manifest themselves in not just language, but all these other forms as well. And so then you start with like, well, okay, we're going to be multimodal now, and we'll look at language in the context of other modes. But then you realize in the end, well, you could actually drop the language if you wanted to. And you can look at the other modes just as well. And then you start to say, well, who am I? Because, starting off with linguistics, and then it's like ecolinguistics, and then it's more like semiotics in all these different media. So I think it's quite good in a way. You start with language and then you work to something bigger. And so I'm quite interested now in the idea of narrative ecology. So if you remember, we're talking about ecolinguistics, which sounds like a form of linguistics. Now we've got narrative ecology, and this is a form of ecology, which is looking at stories and seeing stories as actually part of an ecosystem. So you have animals interacting with each other and interacting with plants and fungus, but you also got these stories which are floating around in this ecosystem as well. And they're having an impact on the world by changing people's behavior. So I quite like this idea of narrative ecology. It's not a discipline that has been explored very much at all. So I'm just thinking about that as a potential next movement. And I kind of went a little bit that way. My last book was Eco-Narrative, and I didn't use the word ecolinguistics in the title or in the book very much at all, really. So I want to kind of reach out. It's not just linguists who are interested in this stuff and this is important for. It's everyone, really. So yeah, for me personally, and perhaps for ecolinguistics as well, is just stepping back a little and seeing what we do in the larger area of narrative ecology. I mean, in terms of promoting ecolinguistics, well, we made this course, The Stories We Live By. It's like a free online course that thousands of people have taken. It's 7 years old now, and right now there's 3,600 people taking it, which is great. And we're producing a new free online course called The Search for New Stories to Live By. We got some funding for this from Erasmus. And this is very exciting. So we only had like 5-minute lectures in the Stories We Live By course, but we're going for 20-minute lectures. And it will be linguistics and ecolinguistics, but it will go beyond that to this more storied kind of approach. So hoping to launch that in September.
That sounds really fascinating. I mean, the first project has been immensely successful, as you say, and now it's evolving into something new and taking a slightly different angle, but the same idea of how the narratives we live by. But I love this idea of narrative ecology, because the fact that narratives are as much a part of our system of living as the material world, as the cognitive world, that these narratives bind it all together. But also from my own perspective, the idea of an ecology of narratives, as I think about positive discourse analysis and the idea that the narratives that we want to promote, it's taking narratives, but how we shape those narratives going forward into the existing context. And this idea of narrative ecology, I like very much, for helping us think about that, but also that we have to think about all these other aspects of this complex dynamic system we live in as we're doing this. So I wish you every success with that course. It sounds very exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing how that goes.
So both courses are going to be on the same website, www.storiescourse.org.
Absolutely. There'll be a link to that, so people can find that directly in the notes to the show. That's fantastic. And that's a great spot to end on. Yeah. Arran, thank you for a really
thanks so much indeed.
enlightening and really fascinating conversation there. I know I've really enjoyed it. It looks like Tom.
I have thoroughly.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you.
Yeah, great talking with you both.
And just a final word from me about my new venture, which is a website called the Discourse Academy. If you're interested in discussion about methods of discourse analysis, taking online courses, signing up for one-to-one tuition, or taking some of my free courses on critical discourse analysis, have a look at discourseacademy.org. If you're listening to this as the episode is published in September 2025, there's currently a free series of webinars on the analysis of representation of social actors. See you next time.